going to talk. All right, just hit the recording. Today we're going to talk a little more about the scientific side of it, actual science. And we're going to start listening to audio documentary. Also, you can think of it as a podcast. It is a podcast, I guess. That heads up uses a lot of language, very normal, regular talking, not so we saw language in a class that was previous, and I gave you the warning during the video. I'm going to give you the warning beforehand. Once we're listening to this podcast, there's going to be words dropped, okay? But we are grown, so we can handle it. Thumbs up if y'all are cool with that. If you could work with it, if you could let it pass over your brain and get the lesson out of it. Okay, good. So let's start with regular stuff. I'm gonna give you some of the basic information that we're working with on slides. And by the end of the class, we should be able to hop onto that podcast and hear a little bit of it. So we're talking today, we already defined racism. We're talking today, racism in sports science. So where is it coming from? One of the first things that lead to, or that has allowed racism in sports science to continue, is the confusion about race and science, or race and genetics. So we established race is a sociological construct. It's created by society and operates in society, and yes, it has consequences in society, but it is a sociological construct. What it is not is biology. Genetics is a biological construct, all right? So race, sociological, genetics, biological. Genetic differences do occur in populations. I am not like any of you. None of you are like each other or me, right? So there's variation. Every individual is unique, hence variation. And there's billions of individuals on this planet, right? There is overlap in which populations are considered as certain races, because race, although it is superficial, is based on appearance. And we get our appearance from our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, all of that going back. So there's going to be overlap. Dark skin is a phenotype. When we're talking about genetics, there's the genotype, which is the chromosomes that we have, the information center. So when you think of our chromosomes, when we think of the nucleus in our cells that hold all of our DNA is like this huge library with all the books, with all the information that makes up a human, right? And so makes up your human, not even my human. Yours would be specific to you, right? So no one's collection in the library is ever going to be the same. But I got all of my books from my parents. So my skin is going to be some combination of either them or their parents, right? My eyes, some combination of theirs. So phenotype is how my skin looks, how my eyes look, how my body functions. Genotype is the actual information, the library that provides the information that makes all of this happen. Okay, so race, since they base race on skin color is a phenotype. They base race on hair texture sometimes. That's also a phenotype. So there will be some overlap, but that's about it. Legitimately, that is it. All right. Everything else about race, is not based on any kind of science or genetics. And even race, in the way we do it now in society with the one drop rule, is not even based on skin color anymore. It's not based on hair type anymore. right? And one drop of blood, that is a proof. The very saying, one drop rule, one drop of black blood, is proof that those people did not understand genetics and how it worked. Okay, so I have some examples about like, okay, so all of these pictures display some twins, right? And twins of mixed race families. Either their parents were mixed race or their parents were two different races, black and white. The top, these young ladies, the young redhead on the left and the young curly haired lady on the right, they are twins. Obviously not identical, but they are twins. You look at them, one is black, one is white. They came from the same parents. So clearly they share a lot of similar genes, but they just happen to get the different ones for the hair color and shade and texture, different ones for their skin, and different ones from their eyes. Okay, but most of their function is probably either very similar, 50% similar, because 50% of their genes from each parent. All right, so the babies below, both parents by a modern standard in the US would probably be considered black, but their babies came out one with dark skin and one with light skin because of the mixture of genetics and the phenotype of skin and hair that comes from their parents, so the grandparents of those babies. Similar with these two guys at the bottom of the screen. Again, twins. One you'd look at and say he's black. The other one, probably most people could look at him and say he's white, or they could say at least racially ambiguous, right? So skin color doesn't even matter with race anymore, right? Because in the US, every one of those families, people is going to be considered black because of the one drop rule. And in other countries, like the girls in that picture are from England, nobody's going to consider the red-haired young lady to be black, right? So one definitely is going to be considered black and one is definitely going to be considered white. Clearly, if it was based on science, it would be the same across all societies because science is just what it is, right? So there is a clear confusion about it. Race is so superficial that it is absolutely not an accurate basis for any genetic or biological ideas, despite what the racial ideology tries to do and say. The danger of using race as a way to explain biological differences is that racists and racism have a history and a habit of distorting science to justify their racist ideas. So I did explain this a little bit, but let's continue. Genetic differences in humans. Y'all are lucky. When I was a child, we didn't have this information. The human genome had not been fully mapped out yet. In other words, scientists had not been able to look at, name, identify all the different genes that are in human cells. Okay, but now that's been done and over again, right? With a lot of different humans, a lot of different genes. And what they found in the Human Genome Project was that 99.9% of human genes are identical, right? So what makes us human, 99.9% of that information, we all have the same stuff. So you know what that means? That means 0.1% is what all the variation in humans, where that comes from. 0.1% of our genetic material. Okay. The expression, like I said, of genetic differences that we can see either physically, like curly hair or green eyes, or functionally, like my blood type, or how, my type 2 muscle fibers, kinesiology folks in here. What we can see or how we function like the visible things, that's called phenotypes. Okay. So if it's not based on genes, if it's not based on genetics, what is Black, what is African, what is African American? So the most we can do or think, we know race itself is kind of arbitrary, but it affects mostly the African diaspora. What does that mean? So those who are considered Black are those who have certain physical features that identify them as African diaspora, meaning somewhere in their ancestry, their people come from or are descendants of the people who were indigenous to the African continent. The African continent had people who were there originally, hence indigenous people. And those people have dark skin, curly hair, and a wide variety of all of that. The skin, the hair, all of that. There's a huge variety because that continent is so extremely big and so many different people, so many different ethnic groups, right? But boiling it down to the skin and the hair and acknowledging that the transatlantic slave trade took people from parts of that continent and forced them to come across the Atlantic or brought them across the Atlantic and put them in the Caribbean, in the United States of America, and the South American continent, part of the continent, like, and some of them ended up in Canada, some of them ended up in England, some of them ended up in other parts of Europe, right? So all those people that were taken from Africa and spread around the world are called the African diaspora. Whether they travel there on purpose in recent years, like immigrating to another country, or whether they were taken, they, are part of the African diaspora. Okay? So the people in the different regions are very different among their different populations. It's easy to think of, okay, Europeans are different, right? There's Italians who are slightly darker white skin, I guess, darker hair, right? They have a very different culture, a language, super different, right? Compared to Germans, who are usually, I would think, when I think of German, I think tall, light skin, considering their history and Nazism, a lot of them are going to have blonde hair and blue eyes or some variation, brown hair, things like that. Not so much going to have black hair as Italians. They're definitely taller and slimmer on average, right? Average height. And when you think of British people, again, all white, but again, likely to be paler in terms of the level of melanin in their skin. Variety of hair colors, probably mostly brown, shorter than Germans for sure, probably not as slim as the population either, and they talk a lot different, right? So if you can imagine the wide variation of Europeans, then Europe is way smaller than Africa, then you can get a better idea of the wide variation of people from the African continent, right? There's a wide variation in Africans. And again, shade of your skin, hair texture, hair length, language, of course, there's so many thousands of languages, cultural differences, right? So it's not hard to understand that Black people are different. But because of racial ideology, all Black people are clumped into one category, as long as they look like they are Black. Here's an example. I just kind of wanted to illustrate how big this continent is right? So African continent could fit North America, well, not the whole of North America, but the US. It could fit China, India, Eastern Europe, specifically Germany, France, Spain. Like it could fit a lot of other countries in this one country, places that we think are big, right? That is how huge the African continent is. So what that means is the people, now on this right-hand side, the people from all these countries in the African continent are going to be different. People from East or, people from Northeast Africa are going to be different from people in West Africa. People from South Africa are going to be different from people in North Africa, right? Folks in Libya, Algeria, much lighter skinned, much more cultural admixture with folks from the Middle East, which is right above here, right? Whereas folks in West Africa, of course, have this variety of different tribes, different ethnic groups, and each ethnic group has their own features. In East Africa, you have the people who are Habesha, who might be from, either Ethiopia or Eritrea. There's the Sudanese who are from right around there, who are very, very dark skinned. There are so many different types of Black people in Africa, right? It's a big and very varied place, right? Oh, how did you end up going? Oh, so with all that understanding of the different people, let's look a little more about like the differences in Black people and how they may or may not affect sports performance. All right. Biological or genetic things that actually affect sports performance, and it depends on what sport. Different sports require different everythings, right? Body shape and size. Okay, so think of basketball and think of LeBron, right? And then think of gymnastics and think of Lord, I'm blanking on her name. She's amazing. Someone put her name in the chat. The top gymnastics athlete in the world, whose name I'm blanking on. So put her name in the chat because I'm blanking on her name, but she's amazing. Simone, yes, thank you. Simone Biles. So think of LeBron, think of Simone Biles. Totally different body shape and size, but well suited to the sports they chose to play and were talented in, right? Okay, fast twitch muscles versus slow twitch muscles. All right. So that means folks with fast twitch are going to be great at sprinting, short distances. Folks with slow twitch are going to be probably better at marathons, long distance, or long endurance things. Lung capacity. All right, that's literally going to determine how long you can go in this game, whatever game it is you're playing. Cardiac output and efficiency. Similar, same. Hand-eye coordination. That's a whole different thing altogether, right? It's not even how you're shaped, it's how you operate, how you function. Your hand-eye coordination. That can be built up since childhood. That's not necessarily even genetic. Flexibility. Again, widely different. All right. These are some biological genetic things. Hand-eye coordination, all of them actually can be nurtured, but you have the physical potential when you're born for these things. You have your slow twitch and fast twitch muscles. You could probably train your body to make them more efficient. Your lung capacity, it is what you were born with. You can train it to get more efficient. All of these things, we can train to be our optimal versions of ourselves, but we are still a version of ourselves. We are reaching our genetic potential and we can't really go beyond that. So those are the physical things. Cultural and ethnic things that might affect performance are how common the activity is in your surroundings, your belief and confidence that you and the people you're around are good at something, right? The value placed on hard work, practice, or excellence in certain fields. Whether relevant activities have played a big part in the population's survival. All right. So let's think about all of that, especially that last one. All right. So cultures develop and, people gain skills over time. So if a culture is used to living in high altitudes, you're still walking down the mountain to, get access to things, people, food, products, trade, or farming, gardening, plants, I don't know, walking back up the mountain, they're probably going to be, in general, have really good lung capacity, really excellent lung capacity in order to live in that environment and do all of that. And those are activities that everybody in that, village, city, culture who live there is going to have because of where they live and how they live, right? So I'm going to show you this video where they talk about the sports gene, which I remember I told you before about how they were literally looking for jumping genes in Black people to explain away why Black people were
We want to turn that to a book. All parents
doing so well in basketball, right? So here's a short feature that happened a long time ago on Good Morning America, okay?
Parents with kids playing sports will want to know about. I loved it. It's called The Sports Gene, Inside the Science of Extraordinary Athletic Performance. I talked to the author, David Epstein, about a headline-grabbing book that he's written. It tackles some of the most controversial, really taboo topics in sports today, including whether nature or nurture makes the best athlete and whether some ethnic groups are better suited to succeed at athletics.
In Kenya, we're used to thinking of all Kenyans as being great runners, but really, when I visited, it's one tiny tribe that makes up 10 to 12% of the population there, the Kalenjin tribe, that produces the vast majority of the good runners. This is a Kalenjin phenomenon, not Kenyan. And one thing that they happen to have is their ancestry is at low latitude, hot and dry climate. They have extremely long limbs proportional to their body size. And that's an evolutionary adaptation for cooling.
So what had been a taboo subject, that certain ethnic groups are genetically predisposed to athletic superiority, really it's more that there's an evolutionary fluke, that there's something that allowed people to get by that then can be applied athletically.
Absolutely, and it means they're worse for some other things. So people with northern latitude ancestry, you and I, Europeans, Michael Phelps, have longer torsos, which is like the long hull of a canoe, so that's better for swimming. He has extremely short legs. Michael Phelps is 6'4", has the same inseam as the guy who holds the world record in the mile, who's 5'9". Those guys wear the same size pants.
And I want to discuss something that a lot of parents watching at home are going to be interested in, the idea of the specialized athlete, the kid who's playing the club, playing year-round, as opposed to maybe someone, say, of my vintage, somebody who played all sports seasonally. What did you find makes the best athlete?
So there's some evidence that in certain sports, gymnastics, some evidence for golf, that early specialization helps. In other sports, it looks like acquiring a range of experiences and skills through your teen years actually benefits athletes later on. You look at a guy like Steve Nash, right? One of the most skilled basketball players who ever lived. Didn't get a basketball until he was 13 years old. Played soccer. So it looks like now that the best thing to do is to sample, find the best fit for your unique genome, and then specialize in the mid-teen years, kind of 15 and 16. That's the pattern that most of the elites have.
Figure out what your skill set is, go find the sport that emphasizes it. It is a fascinating book. We could spend hours on it. We shan't, but it is The Sports Gene. It's by David Epstein. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So much to unpack there. So much. So he does acknowledge some of the same things I acknowledge, right? Like, I know some Kenyans, they don't run, and they do not look like marathoners, right? So you can't just say, oh, you're Kenyan, you were probably great at long distance. Let me put you in a track team. No, can't do that. He talked about this one small ethnic group that lives a certain way and look a certain way, right? Which makes sense. Small ethnic group, similar gene pool, like people are going to develop some similarities, especially if they're not admixing with the folks around them, right? So, or folks far away from them. So, all right. So a lot of the people in that particular ethnic group, they look tall, thin, have long legs, and probably if most of the marathoners from Kenya are coming from that group, probably imagine living in that, say it's a town, living in that town, knowing that, wow, the most famous person who has ever come from your town is a marathon runner. And that's your hero. Probably kids are going to get into running from pretty early and develop and continue getting better, right? So continue producing top athletes. Sometimes it's literally just that these are my heroes and I want to be like them. And they're similar to me. I can see myself in them. So if they're like me, then I could do that. Thumbs up if that makes sense, if you understand that. Representation matters. That's part of it. Okay. He talks about how the people evolved to have evolutionary, thing for cooling. Humans evolved to be humans, and then they became humans, right? We don't then evolve other things. Once you evolve, you become something else. Evolution is what makes species. So the use of that term there, we already see a little bit of racial ideology feeding into how he uses his language. He then went on to say, Europeans have a long torso and short legs. We just kind of established Europeans are very varied. So that's not true, right? So he's using some faulty logic and faulty science to explain, the genetic part of sports. Again, we established that there are biological advantages that make people good at a sport, right? There's variation within every group, right? So him still using that language shows that it has not completely disappeared. Even though he did acknowledge some of the cultural factors, he's still using language that wasn't all accurate. All right, so let's jump back in. Okay, we're going to actually talk or listen to, well, before we do that. So racial ideology in science pivots. It changes to explain things based on what displeases the people in power at the time, right? So throughout history, white Americans initially used pseudo-scientific concepts to first explain why Black athletes were inherently inferior physically and could not compete against white athletes, right? So initially, they were claiming Black athletes being were inferior physically, and they would not want them or let them compete against white people or white athletes in sports, okay? And if they had less training or less understanding or experience with this sport, and a white athletes beat them, it's not because of the less training, understanding, and experience with the sport, it's because they are white and they are physically superior. That's the logic they use to explain when initially in a lot of sports, there were no Black athletes, okay? Then, flipping it around, every time Black athletes do excel in a sport, which has happened more and more over time, it has flipped. They take their pseudoscience and they flip the explanation now, and they're like, oh, yeah, Black athletes are performing better than white athletes in certain sports because they are bred to be bigger, stronger, faster, or because they are more animalistic and therefore more strong because they fight desperately, or because they are evolved for cooling and therefore have longer limbs, right? So you see how racism, and this is seen in lots of other areas as well, it's not just sports, but racism is the core ideology, right? And it is used to explain away the things people who are Eurocentric or anti-Black, right, be like or dislike about people who are not white, Black, or other races, okay? And they use things like they are bred, they evolve, they, you know, they have some sort of physical adaptation, they are more connected to animals. To this day, both white and Black and brown people believe wholeheartedly that Black people have a genetic predisposition to be better athletes than white people. So I'm gonna play 10 minutes, the first 10 minutes of this assignment. And then on Friday, I'm gonna pause here. On Friday, here's what I want you to do. I want you to listen to the entire thing on Friday during class time. So what I will do, okay, actually, let's do a vote. So the entire podcast / audio documentary is a little over an hour. If you listen to it during class time, you'll get through most of it and be able to answer the questions that I post about it, because I'm going to post a quiz about it. Do you want to listen to it on your own, or do you want to come to class and we listen to it together? Give me a second. Let me see if I can make a poll real quick. Okay. 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 Almost done. Okay, so I am launching this poll. Probably might have a typo. See, podcast. I meant podcast. Do you want to listen together during class or listen on your own? You're going to have a quiz on it, so I want to make sure everyone listens. Okay. So far, so good. We have 11 students in the class, and I have 8 answers. So I just need a couple more answers on this vote, on this poll. All right, 10 more seconds for the last 2 folks to answer. This is for class participation, by the way. Remember, I try to find as many objective measures of class participation. That's gonna be one. So tell me if you want to listen to the podcast on your own or listen during class. And I'm gonna end the poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so 9 people answered, and the results are listen together during class. 7 out of 9, and then 2 people listen on my own. All right, cool. That's it. Done. So we're going to listen to the rest of it together in class, but we're definitely going to start it today. And again, heads up, the first 5 minutes, I mean, in general, it's an awesome podcast, but there's a lot of cussing. Okay, so give them some grace. They're amazing. It is a podcast that is created by a scientist, a geneticist, a Black geneticist. And she acknowledges there aren't many of those. But this episode is about Black leads, and the name of the podcast is In Those Genes. So let's listen until a little before we're done.
Hey fam, welcome to In Those Genes, a science and pop culture podcast that uses genetics to decode the lost histories and futures of African descendants. I'm your host, Dr. Janina Jeff, aka your friendly neighborhood Janetta sis. And in this house, we rooting for the Saints.
Who that? Who that said they gonna beat them Saints?
Every episode this season, we're answering the question, is it genetic? And today, we're getting into athletic ability. There's a commonly held belief that Black people are inherently better when it comes to certain sports. If you've been listening to this season, you already know that race and Blackness are social constructs and not supported by genetics or biology. That being said, we can look into the genetic characteristics of people based on a population, like people of African ancestry or European ancestry. Some folks believe that Black superiority in sports is due to some naturally acquired athletic prowess common amongst folks of African ancestry, while others believe it is due to socioeconomic factors shared by Black Americans. In this episode, we'll be exploring how and when Black Americans came to be viewed as superior athletes. Plus, we'll investigate this supposed superiority from the context of genetics, biomechanics, and culture. Let's start at the beginning. Spectator sports became popular in the United States during the same era that America was finding its new racial identity post-emancipation. But the sports landscape then looked a lot different from the sports landscape today. Let's start this episode off with a survey. Our lead producer, Sam, hit up some parks in New York.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you guys' game. I'm working on an audio documentary about sports, and I'm in the park asking people questions.
Okay, good.
All right, so the question is, a little trivia question. From 1875 to 1890, Black American athletes dominated a particular sport. What was the sport?
Basketball, track and field.
Basketball? Football.
I want to say football too.
Baseball.
Baseball.
I'll say soccer.
Basketball.
Basketball.
Horse racing.
How'd you know?
I saw a documentary recently. I stay woke.
People don't know that 13 of the first 15 Kentucky Derbies were won by Black jockeys.
I bet you weren't thinking that. Black sports history is kind of a wild ride.
For African American, sport has always carried a much more weighty gravity.
That's Dr. Harry Edwards. In short, he's a cold mother.
Shut your mouth.
Dr. Edwards is a sociologist and civil rights activist. He's the founder of the entire discipline of sports sociology. Plus, he is a staff consultant to the San Francisco 49ers and to the Golden State Warriors.
Ivy League PhD, 4 Super Bowl rings, internationally known sociologist, Berkeley faculty for 32 years.
I told y'all he cold.
You're damn right.
Hi, Dr. Edwards. So good to,
Hello, how are
to
you?
see you again. Thank you so much for everything.
Oh, absolutely no problem. It's a privilege.
Dr. Edwards joins us on this episode to decipher fact from fiction when it comes to this idea of Black athletic superiority. Let's go back to the stables. In the late 1800s, Black jockeys like Oliver Lewis, George Anderson, and Isaac Burns Murphy dominated horse racing for about 25 years. But the late 19th century American media didn't credit them for being good athletes.
They said that there was some kind of mental connection between the horse and the jockey because they were both so animalistic.
We did an entire episode on how supposed 18th century philosophers tried to characterize people of African descent as a different subspecies than people of European descent. To hear more about how they had us all the way fucked up, you can listen to our episode, How the World Inherited Blackness. For now, let's address the idea that Black jockeys had some kind of connection to horses. Whether a person is of African, European, Asian, or American descent, at any given time, they will share 99.9% of their genome with another human. And each and every one of us shares over 90% of our genomes with horses. In fact, we share over 90% of our genomes with other mammals too. So despite racist notions, those dominant Black jockeys had as much in common with our mammalian cousins as any old white Tom, Dick, or Harry.
Well, I'll be damned.
And this belief that Black folks were other wasn't just reserved for jockeys. In fact, a whole federal mandate that would legalize the separation of Black and white folks was afoot. and it played a huge role in the history of American sports.
Plessy versus Ferguson in 1876, where segregation was ruled as the law of the land.
Homer Plessy was a Louisiana-based pale-skinned man with one African great-grandmother and a whole bunch of European ancestors. He was what folks at the time referred to as Creole. One day, Plessy sat in a whites-only train car and was asked to move to the car for Black people. When he refused, he was arrested. His case made its way to the Supreme Court. The ruling stated that the Louisiana law was constitutional and the segregation of Black people and white people in train cars was just and legal. Quote, as long as the segregated facilities were equal in quality, unquote, even if that wasn't necessarily true. Yet, if a white person was to sit in a car designated for Black people, they wouldn't be denied or arrested or beaten. Maybe some looks, but that's about it.
The reason for Plessy versus Ferguson was not separate but equal. That concept is nowhere to be found in the edict. And the reason was to move Black people back as close to slavery as possible without calling it that. So Black people weren't qualified to sit next to whites on a bus, to live next to whites, to go to school with whites.
Okay, that is a good stopping point. So remember, we stopped at the Plessy versus Ferguson portion of the podcast. On Friday, y'all looking forward to hearing the rest of it? Give me a thumbs up. And we'll do some discussion. Hopefully we'll finish on Friday, but if we go beyond, it'll be all right, okay? So we'll listen to it together. We'll do some discussion to break it up. Well, not discussion, but like maybe some polls or discussions later. And then once we, as a class, have completed the entire thing, we will, yes, I will make the slides available, and you should be able to get the slides from that. We will also do a quiz based on this information because it is packed full of info, okay? So thank you. Happy Wednesday. See you again on Friday. And, oh, I won't see you Monday, but I'll see you Friday. Have a good one. Bye.